speaks to us in certain ways, has given us the Torah, all of that kind of stuff that gives us the relationship that we have as monotheists. And Abraham contemplated for the first time that not only should there not be idolatry, but that there was one God. Now that's not in the text, that story, nor is it that he got so fed up with his father that he walked into the store one day and smashed all the idols, putting his father basically out of business. But again, those are midrashim to show Avram's rejection of idolatry that pointed the way to God speaking, and thus earning his God's favor, and thus God spoke. The stories I just told, not in the biblical text, designed to answer the question of what is in the biblical text. That's midrash. Okay?
That story, where does it come from? Because I've heard it before, but I don't remember where.
Okay, so we have to go back to the oral Torah. Remember that? So in the oral Torah included all of the explanations of the written Torah. And according to tradition, these midrash, or midrashim, were part of God's explanation to Moses that were then, transmitted generation to generation, these stories. And eventually they became written down. And we actually have many of these writings. That's one theory. If you were going by the documentary hypothesis theory that the Torah was written by human beings, that these were, it's considered a collection of sermons by individuals. After the temple was destroyed, Jews built synagogues. Synagogues became a replacement for the temple, both in what was then considered Palestine and outside of Palestine. That's where many of our prayers come from. Some of our prayers that are recorded in the Talmud we see even today, even in all three denominational prayer books. So, that's pretty extraordinary. So, in the afternoon, it's theorized that these preachers, so to speak, kind of like, it's not a great analogy, but kind of, the revivalist in the tent meetings. And those preachers are really, occasionally, like for example, I'll listen to these people on public radio, not NPR, but on FM radio. There's radio stations that have exclusively this kind of telling, and they're very spirited, they're very entertaining, and they're, I always try to, their passion is really strong. I like to listen to them just because, well, I find it always good to hear what the other side is thinking, and their process of how they do things. What I admire, for what it's worth, is the level of devotion, the level of certainty that they have about God's word. Now, whether that's real or not, I can't, that's between them and God, but sure sounds on the surface like they're pretty passionate about what they believe and what they hold to be true and so forth. So I like to listen to it for that reason. So if you can make an analogy, these midrash, the people that went around, the darshanim they were called, they would go around in the afternoon. People didn't have the internet. People didn't have television. They had other things to do. They didn't have, keep in mind, they didn't have books. They didn't have the printing press is 1488, right? So what they would do is they would come back to the synagogue in the afternoon of Shabbat, and these darshanim would come and they would give these drashot. They would start off with some obscure verse somewhere, and they would somehow weave it into the parsha, and they would weave in these stories, these oral stories that they had heard. Just like, if you look at the not the Indian, but if you look at the indigenous tradition, that they have a very rich oral tradition that is very much like Midrash. It's not true, but it speaks, you can't prove it, but it speaks to a deeper truth. And that's what these darshanim, they gave sermons basically, but they were a form of entertainment. And eventually that collection was reduced to various books on midrashim that we have today. We actually have them, which is really interesting. If you study them closely, they cite proof texts from, say, for example, they're going to give a drash on, say, chapter 16, verse 1 of Genesis. But they won't just talk about that. They'll start off with some obscure passage in Psalms. You got to keep in mind, everybody back then had to understand the Torah orally. They didn't have books, so they had a deep understanding of what was the Tanakh. I mean, so they would quote some really obscure verse, and then the entertainment was to see how it was woven into the parsha. And sometimes that would include a drashah, it would include a drash, like I just talked about Abraham, when Abraham was young, and so forth. Now, so if Avram no longer believed in idols and was developing a monotheistic concept about God, then why did God make him leave? Right? Why did he have to leave? And the answer is that, the traditional answer is that he had to leave because he could not raise his offspring in an environment of idolatry. That environment matters. And also, I think another reason I don't know if it's mentioned, but it's there, is that he couldn't develop his ideas and his concept of what relationship to God meant. That serves as a model for us today. By being in a land of idolatry, the environment that you're in matters. And particularly it matters when it comes to matters relating to God and values. There is that, you have to be in the right environment. And therefore, God said, go to the land of Israel. Okay? So you have, once again, you have the Torah, which doesn't give us much of an explanation. And then you have a tradition that emphasizes reason, represent logic, human experience as a basis for him. And you see this constantly in Judaism, that phenomena of reason and faith, and trying to integrate those two together, which is always a challenge. It's always a challenge. And Judaism has been, I would say, one of the religions at the forefront of trying to achieve that integration of reason and faith. Okay, so what is this covenant that is established on the individual level? It says, I'm just quoting a few lines, walk before me and be, God says to Avraham, walk before me, v'hyeh tamim, and be pure. The word tamim means to be pure in ritual, to be pure in your conduct. You'll be the father, the hey that's added to when Avram becomes Avraham stands for Harbe Goyim, that he will be the father of many nations. The name shall be Abraham. He undergoes a name change. And I have followed in his footsteps. I didn't change my name to Abraham, but when I received my semicha, when I received my ordination, I added a name. The Pope does that, but I didn't do it because the Pope did it. I did it because there's a tradition. So I added the name Jacob to my name, and just because I thought, well, the struggle that it took for me, the spiritual struggle and the factual struggle it took for me to become a rabbi, beginning at the age of 37, I identified with that struggle, so I changed to Jacob. He gets assigned the land of Israel. Sarah becomes Sarai, the ritual of circumcision. And here's where you get the documentary hypothesis theory comes on very strong, is that instead of keeping to a narrative, when it talks about Avram having the duty to circumcise as a sign of ritual purity, it goes on to say, it becomes a commandment in Genesis that this shall be a sign of the covenant for generations to come, and the failure to do so, that individual shall be cut off from its people. So if you don't physically cut off a certain part, you're going to be cut off from your people. Circumcision is a very important rite. And when I said documentary hypothesis, that could be looked at as a term that was added. If you're looking at was the Torah written by human beings, that term, the requirement, the mitzvah of circumcision, building off of the Abraham narrative, now becomes a commandment in the book of Genesis. In that addition, one can argue. I'm not saying you have to adopt it.
Can I ask why?
Well, because if you're there's a concept that it doesn't apply exactly, but it's worth the analysis. If you're commanding a group of people to do something, it's always more powerful to do it in the name, take it from someone who tries to convince people to do things. It's much easier if God has commanded it than if Rabbi Boraz commands it. It's a joke, I'm just kidding. I never command anybody to do anything. It's a little bit of a joke. To demonstrate a point, there's a principle in scholarly reading of these texts. It's called pseudepigrapha. And no, it's not something that's kosher, not kosher, the word pig is in there, right? Pseudepigrapha means that you are writing in the name of, you're using a pseudonym, that's a good way to, a pseudonym that's much more powerful than if you write it in your own name. And so therefore, if you're part of the Elohis, the priest, the P, if you're part of P, excuse me, not E, but if you're part of P, the priestly, then you want to say that this is from God, not that the priests are commanding it. So that gets added into, that's just a theory. I don't have any proof of this. How they did that. The reason why they might do that is then circumcision becomes a very powerful ritual. In other words, it's forever. And if you don't do it, you can't really be Jewish.
And I completely understand that part, but how could that be reversed in the JPED scenario?
Right, because that's a great question. You have to go back to what I said earlier, right? The question back here is, well, why does that appear in J? It should appear in Leviticus, right? This is for the people who are online. We now have Larry Miller, and Larry, thank you for joining us this afternoon. So why would P be in J? Well, because probably J, at the time that P was being written, the book of Leviticus was being written, was near completion. J is the earliest. So what they wanted to do was to link that circumcision to J. And that's why Avram does it on the 8th day to Isaac.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
See, that narrative, that gets included into the narrative. Abraham, Isaac, eternal covenant, a sign of the eternal covenant, a sign of being a Jewish male, that will now carry on forever, not just because it says it in Leviticus, but because it said it at the outset of the Jewish people. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Again, that's a documentary hypothesis theory. You're free to believe that the Torah was given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. You can believe in the middle. But my position is I don't get caught up in which one is right or wrong. The Torah has been in its final form since at 525 BCE is the generally accepted date, though some go as late as 388 BCE, 350 BCE during the Hellenistic period. Even so, it's long enough that people have been following it to make it part of our identity. Okay, I don't want to get too caught up in circumcision because I could really get caught up in it. I will tell you this about Talmud, which of course we haven't really looked at. In the Talmud, there was a softening, not of the requirement of circumcision, but what happens if you don't circumcise your child? Is the child still Jewish if born of a Jewish mother? And the answer is probably yes. However, the duty for circumcision, if it's not done, it falls on the father. And if it's not done on the 8th day, it should be done as soon as possible. You do the circumcision. The 8th day is the mitzvah, but if that 8th day passes and the child isn't circumcised, there's still the obligation to circumcise the child. If the father doesn't carry through with it, then when the child becomes an adult in the eyes of Jewish law, which is at 13, then it falls upon the child, it falls upon the individual to circumcise. I don't know actually what the halacha says about what if the child is never circumcised, and that's a subject that has come up in Reform Judaism, because you have some parents who are squeamish about that ritual, and I don't want to go. You do that on a case-by-case basis. I don't want to get into specifics. Just to tell you that it is a minor issue in some families that want to have their children bar mitzvahed or bat mitzvahed, but do not want to have their child circumcised. And that can be an issue. But that's a whole other story. I tend to digress a little bit. Now, that's the personal component of the covenant that every Jew carries with them, and it's represented in the Shema. How so? Not only do we say publicly, but v'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, and you shall love. V'ahavta is in the singular. By the way, God doesn't say the v'ahavta. Moses is the one actually who composed the v'ahavta. Just so it's clear. That's not from God. If you read the text closely, I'm pretty sure, and you're looking a little bit of wonder, I think if we look at, I could be wrong, I don't never admit to being infallible, but I'm pretty sure that it's Moses that's saying it to the people. Yeah.
I thought the V'ahavta was in Deuteronomy.
It is.
Yeah.
And Deuteronomy is considered to be the book of Moses. Absolutely. Yeah. So the V'ahavta, the book of Deuteronomy, which is D, which is the very last in the documentary hypothesis, is about, they estimate about, during the time of Hezekiah reforms, I sort of think it during that period, about 700 BCE, about in that range. And that's the classic example that the documentary hypothesis posits, that D was written in the name of Moses, but was really written by the Deutero-Isaiahs, the disciples of Isaiah. Okay, that's a theory that, and some of that's based on lots of different things. But just to go back to Deuteronomy, you shall love, that's singular. The duty to love God is in the singular, it's not in the second person plural. If you want to look at the second person plural duties, you look at the second paragraph of the Shema, which is, by the way, is omitted in the Reform prayer book. There you have second person plural. V'haya im shemoah tishma'u, and it shall come to pass if you shall hearken diligently unto the Lord your God to obey his commandments, then the ground will yield its fruit in its appropriate time, and you shall eat and you shall be satisfied. But if you don't, lots of bad things will happen. And then, v'limadatem otam, you shall teach them, that second person plural. But in the first paragraph of the Shema, it's singular. So we have singular and the peoplehood, okay? Now, in Exodus, this is where we get into a new covenant. A new covenant that is peoplehood oriented. The Jewish people over time, from the time that they descended into Egypt to the time that they left, are being transformed into a people. They are no longer a collection, they are a collection of tribes to be sure, but they're now going to develop a mission statement. If you look at the movie The Ten Commandments, right? The Ten Commandments is, our God is going to lead us out of Egypt. But if you look at the text and you look at what the story is, they just know that they're descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They don't know about the Torah. The reason they don't know about the Torah is because it hasn't been given yet. That becomes sort of the mission of the Jewish people, which leads us into chosenness. Is that all pretty clear so far? Any questions? I'm happy to stop at this point, have a drink of my Diet Coke, and ask any questions you want.
You digress to the circumcision. It seems to be transcend the Jewish population too. Is coming into the Christian population also.
Yeah, I think in the Christian population it's not required, but in the Jewish world it is.
Do the rabbis
Yeah, you do
it
it. I mean, yeah, for there are the people that don't are in the minority, are in the clear minority. Circumcision is always, not always, but I would say at least in 85 to 90% of the cases is done. I think that even in Reform, it's very much favored. It's very much urged.
I think it's even higher.
What's that?
I believe it's even higher.
Could be, yeah. Just as an aside, the people that I have converted here, and we're a classical Reform congregation, the people that I've converted here, much to my surprise, want a very traditional conversion. They don't want the Reform version, which I think is interesting, but that's a whole nother, I don't want to get into that. So, anyway, if you look at Exodus 19, that's the key passage. I brought you forth from Egypt for a purpose. I brought you here on eagle's wings. I brought you to me, to this mountain. Shemoah tishma means you shall surely pay attention. Shema means to hear, but not only just to hear physically, but to hear with your heart, hear with understanding, with kavanah. Tishma, the phrase Shema is what's called infinitive absolute. It's a very stressful kind. It's stressing that you have to hear this message and understand it, that you shall keep my covenant, and you will be a treasure unto me from all the nations. La'am sugula mikal ha'amim. This is where you have the first real statement of separateness from the Jewish people from the rest of the world. La'am sugula mikol ha'amim. You shall be a treasure from among all the nations. Okay? Why? For all the earth is mine. I'll just put a footnote. The word ha'aretz is used. And ha'aretz in some rabbinic literature is often a reference to the land of Israel, not the earth, the total globe. It's also a midrashic reference to Israel. So once again, you have a hidden meaning in the use of that term, for all the earth is mine, meaning that the children of Israel, and this is really important, are going to get the Torah, and they're going to get the land of Israel. But them getting the land of Israel and living there is conditional upon observing the Torah. Okay? In other words, it's a tendency. It's not a forever thing. And if you really read the text and you read it closely, it's not a guarantee that if you disobey God, if you worship other gods, then you will be thrown out. And there will be one day a She'erit Yisrael, a remnant of Israel that will one day return. I think that's at the very end of Deuteronomy. In the part, I'm not sure. And again, I always worry about things being posted on YouTube. I always want to be correct, but I believe that that it's in Ha'azinu, the very last, that second to last chapter, last parsha, the second to last parsha of the Torah. And there is a very violent description of what will happen in Moses' vision to the children of Israel, on down the road. And so it's a conditional tendency that they have to obey God, they have to follow Torah, they have to observe it. Yes?
I was going to say it's conditional, but the land still remains the property of Israel. They just aren't living in it. Because it's God's land.
It's God's land,
never
and
gives
God's
up ownership.
Yeah, if you look at the first commentary by Rashi, the very famous biblical scholar of the 11th century, that's his very first commentary that he gives to his father out of honoring your father and your mother. Rashi's commentary is the one you always many rabbis will look at first before doing anything else. And his father said the reason why it begins with Bereshit, again this is a midrash, is because to show that God owns the entire earth and he can give the land to whomever he wants, and he can expel anybody who he wants. And therefore if the Gentiles will come to the children of Israel and said, you stole the land from the Canaanites, the response should be that all the earth is God's, and God can give the land to whomever he wants, and he can throw out whoever God wants. He chose to give it to the Canaanites first, and then threw them out, and then God chose to give it to us. Of course, the weakness of that commentary is that it was written in the time when the Jews were in exile. So, we were dispossessed of the land. In traditional Jewish thought, we were exiled because of our disobedience to God, because we worshipped other idols, because we were not faithful to God. And therefore, it wasn't the Romans that threw us out, it wasn't the Babylonians, it was God using the Babylonians, or using the Romans as instruments to throw us out because we no longer deserved to be in the land. Okay. And our mission, we got our mission statement. Our mission statement there was to be a kingdom of priests, and Rashi comments, we're not talking about a priesthood that makes sacrifices, we're talking that everyone would be a priest. Everyone would be likened to the Kohanim, to be holy, and we would become a holy nation. Okay? A mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, v'goy kadosh, and a holy nation. And the people responded later on in Exodus 24:7, na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will understand. In other words, they accepted the Torah, and there's a whole slew of commentaries about the Jewish concept of chosenness that addresses the concept of why the Israelites were chosen. So I'll just give a few to give you an example of what they were struggling with. So there's a midrash that says, why was the Torah given in the wilderness? The Torah was given at Mount Sinai, which was in a wilderness. And the answer is because the land, I'll use the Hebrew term, it's a legal term, because the wilderness is hefker, meaning hefker means it's ownerless property. You can't get charged for trespassing if you go in wilderness. And nobody owns that land, it's not, So the Torah was given in the wilderness so that anybody who wanted to receive the Torah would be able to receive it. The Jews came into the wilderness and they accepted it and they received it. Okay? That's one. So the Torah is available to everyone. The Jews, and that kind of idea, the Jews chose to accept the Torah. And so this chosenness wasn't that God chose us, we chose God. Right? See, because we were in the wilderness, we accepted it, we said, na'aseh v'nishma, we will do it and we understand.
That really turns it on its head. I mean, that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting midrash, right? There was another midrash that said that we were the very last people on earth that we were offered the Torah. That every other nation was offered the Torah, and they always said, well, what's in it? And they said, so God said, well, you can only eat certain kinds of food. Can't eat this, can't eat that, and you can eat this, and so forth, kosher. Because there are kosher and non-kosher animals that are mentioned actually in the Torah, not talking about the oral law. And they said, well, we don't want to follow that. We couldn't do that. There's another one that talks about, well, there's, I'll make this a little more juicy, so to speak. There's some prohibitions about who you can have relations with. Okay, you can't, when you get married, you can't have relations outside, you can't commit adultery, and some of the nations didn't like that one. So, no, we're not going to. So there's a series like that, okay, a series of midrashim, or there's one midrash that's like that, but the Jews, when we were offered it, said, na'aseh v'nishma, we didn't even ask what was in it. We will do it and we will understand. And that's how we became the chosen people. Again, that's midrash to explain and to soften this aspect that we were God's chosen people. There's a self-consciousness in these midrashim that explain what the concept of chosenness means. It implies that everyone has an opportunity to be, quote, the chosen people. We specifically as a people decided to choose it. Yes?
Maybe that goes back even before the Mosaic to the commandment, first commandment, that I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me.
Yeah, people want to do, I'm sure I could find a midrash that said something, well, we want to retain our belief in multiple gods. And Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the Lord your God. Right? The notion that laws were promulgated by God and not by kings, that was an anathema maybe to many of the nations. Once again, these are parables. These are stories that embellish the biblical narrative. But at the core of it, we were supposed to be a mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests, v'goy kadosh, and a holy nation, as encapsulated in the Torah. Okay. Um, let me see. There was something else. Now, there's another midrash, and I think if I've told this to you before, then just stop me. I think in explaining what a midrash was, I used this example. When the Jewish people received the Torah at Mount Sinai, it says they stood b'tachtit el hahar, they stood at the base of the mountain. But the Hebrew tachat, basic Hebrew, tachat means underneath. You can hear the Hebrew is a language of roots. B'tachtit, in the context, meant at the base of hahar, the mountain. A midrash says, no, they wouldn't stay at the base of the mountain. They were underneath the mountain. God took the mountain, inverted it upside down, held it over their heads and said, unless you accept the Torah, this will be the end of you. So they said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do it and we will don't drop the mountain on us, we will do it. On one level, it's very funny, right? I mean, you just picture it, oh my God, take it easy, you know? Just cool it, you know, we got this one, don't worry. And again, I'm being funny, you know, I'm sure that when I go up to heaven on Judgment Day, God's going, why'd you make such a joke out of that? You know, this wasn't funny at the time when I did that. But I'm sure when I get up there, I'm going to get called on several accounts. Well, I said, you know, got this documentary hypothesis here, and God's going to say, what? Anyway, to go back, but there's an underlying truth to that, right? Remember, these midrashim were sermons. And what was the sermon? What's the sermon in that? The sermon is that without the Torah, you're going to die in the wilderness. You're not going to have a mission. You're not going to have a purpose. The purpose is whatever you decide to do, that's what you decide to do, and you're going to go the way of other nations. But unless you have a transcendent purpose, unless you commit yourself to a higher law and the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of righteousness, and the belief in a higher God that gives laws so that individuals can't come and usurp those laws, and that we're always struggling to figure out what it is that God wants us to do based on what we read in the text or based on what our understanding of Torah and Judaism or religion is supposed to do, you're going to end up like the Edomites. You're going to end up like the Moabites. You're going to end up like a lot of nations that have come and gone that don't believe in a higher power that promulgates righteous laws and for you to figure out and to work and apply those on the face of the earth. And you know something? I think there's a lot of truth to that. I don't think we would have survived had we not had this thing that's in the ark. I don't think we'd be here today. I think it's central to the Jewish people. However we understand, however we interpret it, because as we know, based on Talmudic principle, God gave us the Torah, but God doesn't have the right to interpret it for us. An interesting idea. There's a story in the Talmud that speaks to that directly. It's a very interesting story. One day, but not now. It would take us too long. Okay. So, what do we have here? If you go to Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 9, you'll see this in Moses' sermon to the Israelites before entering the Promised Land. There is a sense of entitlement to the land of Israel. The word chosen actually appears there. Bachar actually appears in Deuteronomy 1 through 7. God has chosen you. And finally, there is a carrot and stick approach. The carrot is, if you follow the mitzvah, you follow Torah, here's the land, it's going to be wonderful. If you don't, here's the stick, I'm going to drive you out of the land. I have here verse 11. If I had a Tanakh here, I could look this up. I'm going to do that now.
Do you want me to get you a?
No, I got it. I got it.
Good.
Thank you. It's a short passage.
While you look that up, I just want to throw in one thing that
Sure.
kept us also together as a people,
Mm-hmm.
and that was Hebrew.
Yeah.
That was having the text itself in Hebrew,
The
and
language?
eventually modern Hebrew, because you take a people, like you look at the
Language.
indigenous people,
Right.
and you take their language from them, you take a richness of their oral tradition away as well.
Right. Now, Hebrew is a subject, or has been a subject of controversy. The use of Hebrew has been a subject of controversy, especially in the Reform movement, because Hebrew is hard to read. And what are you going to emphasize when you send your kids to Hebrew school or religious school, say, once a week? What are you going to emphasize if you only have them? Are you going to really emphasize? Hebrew's hard, not easy. And in classical Reform settings, probably up to about 1970, Hebrew was de-emphasized. It was not, even though the Union Prayer Book has a fair amount of Hebrew in it, surprisingly enough. In classical Reform Judaism, many Jews who grew up in that environment did not have their knowledge of Bible is wonderful, and their sincerity and devotion is without question, but the Hebrew was not emphasized. Hebrew is Lashon Kodesh. That began to change in 1990 with the National Jewish Population Study, which saw a dangerous trend of assimilation and disaffiliation. And one of the things that was thought about, particularly in the Reform movement, conservative movement always emphasized Hebrew, Orthodoxy, of course, was that Hebrew was part of the Jewish identity, and what we needed to do was build Jewish identity. So there was a shift, and Hebrew became much more prominent in more modern Reform practice than in classical Reform practice. Here, this is a classical Reform temple. Its history is much more linked to classical Reform than modern. And there is this ongoing dialogue about how much Hebrew should be in the service, particularly for some of our older or more senior members who grew up with a largely predominant English service. But if you look at, and so we are trying to always modulate a balance between Hebrew and English, because at the end of the day, we want people to pray. We don't want people to walk away. I couldn't pray. It was all in Hebrew. I can't read Hebrew. The phonetics mean nothing to me, and I get that. I mean, and the irony. So here's the irony. There's an irony here, is that there's a big debate in the Talmud whether the Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, V'ahavta et Adonai, you shall love the Lord your God, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, whether that needs to be read in Hebrew, or can you say it in any language that you understand? There's a big debate in the Talmud. And the Talmud comes out and says, at the end, the halacha is that you can recite it in any language that you understand. You don't have to recite it in Hebrew. The most important thing is to understand what the Shema is about. Okay? In Reform Judaism, the halacha is just the opposite. The Shema you have to say in Hebrew. The classical Reform, you have to say the Shema in Hebrew, not in English. So it's I thought it was interesting that in Reform Judaism, the halacha in this case, the Jewish law in this case, is more stringent than the halacha of that of the Talmud. So what is verse I'm looking at? Verse 11. Okay, verse 11 says, and you shall keep the commandment, the ordinances, and the judgment that I have commanded you today to do them. And as we've learned before, the mitzvah refers to the oral law. The chukim are ordinances which have no rational basis, like say kashrut, or shatnez, which is mixing wool and linen in the clothing. You do them out of pure faith. People don't really understand that kashrut is not about health. It's just we do it because God has commanded it. There are some laws that are just like that. And finally, mishpatim, there are judgments, meaning if this happens, then this will happen. If you see your neighbor's donkey with a burden fallen on the road because the burden has become too heavy, it's collapsed, even if it's your enemy, then you help the enemy to ride the donkey and you lighten its load. So, okay. So there's no reward. Now this is something to keep very important. In the Torah, there's no reward other than the land of Israel in continuity. There is not, and I'm going to underline this, there's not a mention of salvation, that if you do these things, you're going to end up in heaven. The Torah is very silent on that question. Torah doesn't speak, at least not that I'm aware of, the Torah doesn't speak, maybe indirectly in an odd kind of way, but now there's no direct salvation for doing these things. The salvation comes in the continuity of the people. You're going to live, you're going to die. If you keep the commandments, there's going to be continuity. Your children and your children's children will enjoy the fruits of the land.
Is there a mention of going to Abraham's bosom or anything
No.
like that?
No, if there's that reference, it would be prophetic. It would be, it's from another source, I think. I mean, again, if you, to the people who are online, the people who will view this online, if you find something that I've said that is not, that can be contradicted in the Torah or that needs to be explained or something I'm saying is not accurate, please write me, because I'm in the pursuit of truth just like all of you. Okay, where are we at? Oh my goodness. Okay, we have 6 minutes. Okay, I'm on page 2 of my outline. Isn't that weird? And there's only, I've got like 5 pages, so we're going to continue. I'm going to read you a contemporary understanding of the chosen people in Reform, Conservative, and Orthodoxy, so that you have a sense of, well, what did we do with that idea? I've just given you a pretty good foundation of what it means according to the Bible. What does it mean to be the chosen people? You could imply a superiority, but I would urge us to not think of it that way. In the liturgy, it does say, when we cite the blessing over the Torah, that we have been chosen from among peoples. But it didn't mean that we were better. We were just chosen for a particular purpose. One can be holy, this is what I believe, one can be holy and close to God in many, many different ways. Our chosenness comes from the uniqueness of our scripture and how that's been interpreted over generations of time. For example, there's nothing in the Torah about a bar mitzvah. Nothing. I don't think. Jewish adulthood is just assumed. But there's this beautiful ceremony called a bar mitzvah, where these blessings are first recited. And there's beauty in it. It's a beautiful ceremony, a bat mitzvah or b mitzvah, whatever the case may be, about a child who's beginning to go through puberty and is now being impressed that despite all the physical changes that you're going through and the development of your gender biologically, there is a corresponding moral obligation that needs to be continuously developed. To be good to one another and how that's practiced as a teenager. What does it mean to follow commandments and to obey God? And at 13, that's not too young of an age to begin or to continue in a more adult way the ethical, moral, and spiritual development of one's child, and that's what that ceremony is all about. That's it. So when they say Asher Bacharbanu, that you have chosen us Mikol Amim from all peoples, when they recite that over the Torah, it's not only a question of Jewish identity. That's not the right answer. The right answer that you've chosen us to have this special, unique relationship that carries with it ritual, moral, and moral obligations. And it's in the pursuit of that to learn how to distinguish between right and wrong. That, by the way, happens to be an ongoing struggle. I don't think you ever, if you're truly a religious person, I really believe that you adopt Robert Frost's insight that the religious person is never quite sure whether his or her actions are right in the eyes of God. There is that ongoing sense of humility. And if somebody feels haughty because they feel they're the chosen people, I would contend that they missed the point.
Is that word called conscience?
What's that?
That word called conscience?
Conscience, yeah, exactly. You know, God lies in the heart of the human being, the conscience of the human being. And it's that tension between what I want in this world, what the world needs, and how I balance those two, how I fulfill my moral obligation. It implies a moral obligation to, I'll use a broad term, tikkun olam, to make the world a better place than it was before you got here. You know, and that I think is probably a very good place for us to stop. And then next week, what I'll do is maybe I'll make some copies of these various statements by the various movements about what chosenness means and how it's even changed over time. People's view of it has changed. So I want to thank you for all coming. It's 1:30 now. I don't want to keep anybody over time. I thank you all for coming. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions or comments or anything you want? I'm happy to answer them.
I am married to you, and I have been a student of Torah, and every time I hear you lecture, I learn something new.
Oh,
I'm always amazed. Thank you.
Thank you. I promise to do the dishes this coming week in exchange for.
I like it when a husband and wife adore.
Thank you, honey. Thank you very much for that.
No, I do.
No,
I
I really
always do.
appreciate
I'm
it.
always surprised.
Well, thank you.
I like it when a husband and wife are really like each other.
Is it possible to give a brief understanding of why the Jewish person is Jewish through the mother and not the father?
I can give what I think to be from this question came up when I was in rabbinical school. I haven't researched it as much, but that's a historical development, I believe. The halacha changed over time. The halacha used to, when I say halacha, it means Jewish law.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry, I should always, it comes from the word halach, which means way, which is a little bit different from law. Law has a kind of, you know, this is what you do. Halacha has a little bit broader usage than just, quote, law. But the halacha used to be that the father, particularly in biblical times, I believe, that's where your lineage came from.
Right.
Once Jews were dispersed or began to live outside or were subject to foreign rule, sometimes Jewish women, and this is recorded either in the Mishnah or the Talmud, that on certain days prior to the wedding, the governor of the town would come and to show his power would take the bride and have relations.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes Jewish women who lived in foreign countries were kidnapped. And so there was always what's called a safek, a doubt about, there could be a potential doubt as to who the father was. But there could be no doubt as to who the mother was. Now that's a historic basis. I haven't researched it all that closely,
That's what I
but my
always
guess is that
understood
there's some
too.
truth to that.
In medieval times in England and France and other places, they had what they called droit au ségur, I believe is that. My French is terrible, where the right of the Lord to have the woman at the wedding night.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's
Awful.
not, that's,
Awful.
Mhm.
yeah, it was practiced, it was a terrible practice, but that's
Awful.
England, Scotland, Ireland.
See, now under Jewish law,
And it's in France, it was in France, it was all European and even in Oriental nations.
Yeah.
They had that.
you see, while a king under Jewish law could promulgate law,
Mhm.
the law could not go against Torah.
Mhm.
If it went against Torah, you had a check, you had the Sanhedrin that could rule against the king if the king promoted a law that was in violation of what was written in the Torah. It was like a constitution. And the king in Deuteronomy could make laws, but they had to be consistent with Torah. They couldn't contradict. A law that said they would give the king right to have relations with a bride or a married woman, despite the precedent that David set, is wrong. And that would be a violation of the Torah. That would be the lo tinaf, you shouldn't commit adultery. That's a direct violation of that commandment. Couldn't promulgate a law like that.
I've always liked Nathan's rejoinder to.
Well, he got reprimanded for that. You know,
That's one of my favorite verses.
yeah.
There was one other thing that I've
Please.
been wondering about, and are there any Jewish people in China?
There used to
Great
be.
question.
Yeah, there used to be. There's a funny story that goes with it. There used to be a congregation,
I think there is.
there may still be, I
I
don't think
believe so,
so.
because Chabad was,
Well, Chabad, I mean, they're everywhere.
yeah.
But there's, oh God, what was the name of that town? I'll get the name of the town next time. It was,
It's a big country.
I just don't remember the name of it, but there was a specific town
Yeah.
that had Jewish people.
Oh.
An interesting story that goes to that. And by the way, if you all want to sign off, we're just about done. There was a Japanese ambassador to Lithuania during World War II. His name was Sugihara, and his wife. Are you familiar with the story?
Yeah.
So he issued visas for Jews to get away, despite Japanese, which was part of the German Axis, told him not to do that. He did it anyway. He became a righteous Gentile, was stripped of his powers, punished for it, came home in disgrace. Only years later was he appropriately honored for disobeying the Japanese command, because you obey the government in Japan. That was a very important thing. Anyway, so he issued all these visas to Jews that were, day and night, he and his wife wrote visas to the Dutch Antilles.
Wasn't he made a friend of Israel or something?
He was a righteous Gentile, yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah.
That's right,
That's
yeah.
what it's called.
Yeah, he was appropriately honored and rightfully so. It
That's
was his
great.
whole life and career to do that.
Wasn't there a movie made
Yeah.
about it?
I think he's.
I don't think there was a movie about Sugihara. I could be
Was it?
wrong.
I thought there was,
No, but.
There might have been.
I remember reading his story and.
yeah.
It's
he
an
risked-
amazing story.
He risked a lot,
Yeah.
It's
So
like-
I don't know if it was China or, I think it was Japan.
Japan.
So the people who came, who got these visas, they had to go east. They couldn't go west. But they had a visa to the Dutch Antilles, because that's where they could get to. But it was up to them to get there. But they couldn't go west because they had to go through Germany. They had to go to a port, and no port was going to accept them. So they fled east through Russia, and they ended up in, of all places, ended up in Japan. And I think there was some cable transactions between the Japanese and the Nazis, because they were part of the Axis, to send these Jews back to the country. And the Japanese refused, and there's all kinds of reasons why they refused to do that, or thought, and that is that they thought, I think it was Japan, not China, because China was not a power during World War II. I think it was
No,
the
they were
Japanese.
not, they were pretty worthless, really.
Yeah, they were pretty worthless,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, they were powerless. And they didn't give them back. There's all kinds of theories about why they didn't do that. First of all, they were smart. They were not stupid by any stretch. And they thought, gee, if the Jews control the newspapers, they control the finances of the world, and they do all these
Sure.
terrible things that control the world, maybe we can learn something from them. It's true. I mean, that was one of the theories. So we're going to keep them here. And we're just going to kind of study them a little bit and see what we can learn from
Kept
them.
them alive.
Eventually, they came to the United States during the war. They came vis-a-vis the West Coast. Raphael Lemkin, who was the key person who drafted the Geneva Convention on Genocide,
Yeah.
international warrior of fame, who escaped and lost his whole family in the Holocaust and bore that burden. His story is incredible. After the end of the war, it took him 3 years of constant. Congress got so fed up with him, or leadership in the United States, they refused to talk to him. Reporters ran from him because all he wanted to do was talk about the need for international law for a convention on genocide. And he kept pounding and pounding. He was like possessed. He was like just possessed to get this done. And lo and behold, I think in 1948 or 1952, I forget, there was a Geneva Convention on Genocide by the United Nations. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair, and they passed his writing on what constituted genocide and how countries or leaders would be held liable if they committed genocide? What were
And there was
remedies?
no word such as genocide prior to that, correct?
He invented the word genocide.
That's
He
what I
felt that what was happening to the Jews in Europe and to his family deserved a new word. That was
There
not,
wasn't even
because
a
what
word
was
before
happening
that.
was so massive and so unusual that a new word needed to be created. And he did this in 1942, 1943.
Mhm.
So he created the word genocide from the word, there's a Greek word geno or something, and then of course that means kill, yeah.
People side,
To kill a generation, I guess, something.
generation, yeah,
yeah.
the whole people.
We'll find out about the Chinese though for you. I'm actually interested.
And with that, we'll
myself.
stop. Thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it. And we'll pick this up next time. We'll continue the covenant of the Jews as a chosen people, part 2.
You're a priesthood of believers.
What's that?
Priesthood of believers.
A priesthood of believers is
That's, we
right.
use that word in the
Yeah.
Christian faith, and I thought, well,
Yeah.
it is, when you look at God, you are a priesthood of believers.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You two are very learned and it's very nice to study with you. You truly are, I can tell.
Now, we-
I can
Oh my
really tell.
goodness.